Hello, everybody. My name is Mévellec, and I am pleased to welcome you on behalf of the Center on Governance at the University of Ottawa, directed by Professor Éric Champagne. The center combines 5 networks of research, and I am myself the head of the urban and territorial one. So I'm very pleased to welcome you today for the first webinar of this network. In Ontario, 2022 has been a busy year for municipal politics, with elections in the fall, but also with several proposed provincial reform to strong mayors on housing. These reforms will likely keep us busy for several more months, such as the Bill 23. To start the year, I propose rather to return to issues that affect all of us in large and small municipalities, but whose implication for urban governance we are not always aware of. That's why I invited Zachary Spicer to talk about his latest book on the platform economy and the smart city. I'm personally very pleased that Zach has agreed to present his work on this topic. Zachary Spicer is an associate professor in the School of Public Policy and Administration at York University. His background is both academic and practical, as he has also served as senior policy advisor with Ontario's Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing. His background is first defined both by academic excellence and practical experience in public policy. Like many local policy researchers, Zachary has worked on a wide range of topics, including intermunicipal cooperation, digital elections, municipal autonomy, Rob Ford, municipal electoral behavior, and mayoral transition teams. All this research makes one of Canada's leading experts on municipal policies and politics. So today, Zach will talk about technology, governance, and Canadian municipalities. He has recently published a report for the Institute on Municipal Finance and Governance at the Munk School of University of Toronto, which is a major source of knowledge production and analysis on the municipal scene in Canada. He also has edited a book with Austin Swick, the platform economy and the smart city at McGill Queen's University in 2021. So before I turn it over to him, I would just like to point 2 technical things. First, the webinar will, in fact, is recorded and will be posted online. Second, you will be able to ask questions and make comments in the chat in French or in English. If you want, you can also raise your hand at the end, and we will invite you to ask directly your question to Zach. Éric Champagne and I will be able to pass them to Zachary at the end of his presentation. And finally, I would like to thank Anna and Maya for their usual but always valued help in organizing this event. So it's your turn, Zach. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Anne. Just before I get started, just very quick thank you to Anne and Eric and the Center on Governance for having me here today. So out of all the topics that Anne mentioned, obviously I have my hand in a bunch of things, but what I wanted to talk about today was that report that Anne mentioned, Digital Dilemmas, that's published with the Institute on Municipal Finance and Governance. And it's a bit of a different type of research project, but I think it's critically important because it has a lot of practical implications. So what we did when we began that project was to think about the really kind of pressing challenges that practitioners are facing and how that aligns with some of the academic interest within this space. So what we came up with was a somewhat interesting approach. So we held a series of events in early 2022 and produced a report based upon those discussions with some added context around the institutional features of Canadian local governments. I'll get into all that today. More than happy to present that to you. When I got the invitation to speak today. I was particularly excited because all of that happened about a year ago. And so, as we know, the sort of policy space around everything digital moves very, very, very quickly. So I was very excited about the possibility of getting to kind of interesting discussion about where things have gone since and where some of these pressures are still present for municipal governments and where they may be worsened or gotten better. So all to say, I'm very interested in your questions and feedback today. But with that said, it's a bit of a different type of research project with a very practical focus. So it may not be as empirically or theoretically rich as you may be used to at an event like this. But I do hope that it has some ability to help municipalities begin to wrap their heads around some of these pressing and emerging digital challenges that they are facing. So just a quick bit of background. This particular paper is available on the Institute of Municipal Finance and Governance website. So the IMFG website is there. There's a link that I'll provide at the end of the presentation, but you can certainly Google it. It's on the website. And essentially what we did is we hosted 3 panels in early 2022, focused on 3 pressing digital challenges: the platform economy, smart cities, and cyber attack. And I thought that this could be an interesting topic for today's webinar because it covers a lot of ground as opposed to simply talking about one particular subject. So we'll go into a lot of different places today. But IMFG is known for doing some really practically focused work, and of course for chat. Wonderful, thank you, Anne. Appreciate that. For doing some really practically focused work and really aligning what practitioners are feeling with research capacity that's out there in the Canadian local government research space. So they are generously supported by a number of municipal governments, mostly around the Greater Toronto area. And every year they sort of get together and sort of feel them out in terms of, where are the pressing issues, where's the research need. And every year they hear, a kind of standard set of issues, right? Revenue shortfalls, legislative gaps, planning issues, stuff like that. In 2021, they all the sort of pressing issues were really around technology, right? So a lot of questions around the platform economy. A lot of people saying, well, the sort of market has changed for a lot of these platform firms. Their behavior has changed. The regulatory mix that we need for some of them is changing. We're having some trouble keeping up. Smart cities saying, well, they were under increased pressure from the public to increase the digitization of public services, and we're getting pressure from above, from some of these technology vendors, from council, to really kind of adopt smart city technology. We don't have the capacity to really think through some of these weighty issues. What are we supposed to do, right? Where are the data governance standards? How do we wrap our head around IP? What's happening here, right? And then finally, cyber attack. So this is something that is a daily concern for both large municipalities, small ones, particularly small ones who are particularly vulnerable to a cyber attack. So we have systems that are vulnerable. We have history of cyber attack across the province that have had fairly catastrophic consequences, where entire IT systems have been seized, which is really not only slowed workflow, employees can't even get into email and everything else, but there's emerging concerns about the ability of hackers to be able to sort of capture digital infrastructure. So there was a couple of high profile examples in the US where water infrastructure was seized, and the sort of chemicals were being put into the water were being increased slowly, and there was a clear public safety and public health challenge there. So I said, listen, we're not just playing with this sort of administrative capacity of the municipality itself. We are very worried about public safety. So the IMFG brought me in, and we met, and we say, what do we do about this? And we thought, well, why don't we bring together a couple of different panels, and we'll bring practitioners together with academics, and we'll start to sort of think through some of these challenges, and not just discuss the challenges, but also thinking about how municipalities can actually respond. And what I did from there was to sort of think through what the participants said, and instead of kind of repeating verbatim what they said, I wrapped that up into a report which is available on the MHU website and in the chat as well. Thanks to Anne. Really highlighting where some of the unique institutional constraints lie for municipalities that are exacerbating some of these particular challenges. So that's what I'm going to get into today. But before we do, let me just sort of talk a little bit about the panels and some of the sort of higher level findings. We started out on February 1st, 2022 with a panel on municipalities and the platform economy. We were very fortunate to be joined by Betsy Donald, Jason Rayner, and David Waxsmith, who really kind of focused on the evolving regulatory mix for platform firms, but also we had a really interesting conversation around data. So when you think about emerging digital pressures and threats and trends, you may not think of the platform economy as being top of mind. You may be thinking to yourself right now, well, Uber and stuff has been around in Toronto, for a decade by this point. Certainly this is not something that is new. But the sort of market for platform firms has changed. Their operations have changed. Their fortunes in a number of cases have declined significantly. As a result, their behavior towards municipalities and consumers has also changed. Municipalities, since initially regulating a bunch of platform firms, have taken a number of different rethinks and have repositioned in a number of ways. Strengthen regulations around driver licensing and vehicle licensing and stuff like that. Strengthen regulations around enforcement of Airbnb in relation to neighborhood concerns, things along those lines. But there is still this notion that the regulatory mix isn't really right. What the panel identified here is that the one thing that has really kind of fallen short on the regulatory side is that municipalities still aren't really accessing the data that is being produced by these firms. So what's sort of meant by that is that there's really good public use data being generated by a lot of these various platforms, right? So thinking about things like Uber and Lyft, right? That's a lot of really good information about how people want to move around a city, right? When they want to move around, where they're going to, where they're coming from, that can help support transit improvements, infrastructure improvements, stuff like that can help us get our minds around urban mobility and some of the challenges associated with it. So we don't really have a lot of that data. We still don't. Municipalities aren't sharing, and the panelists highlighted a couple of instances where it's even led to various court actions. So there still are some challenges wrangling and exerting control over various platforms out there. Jason Rayner, who at the time of the panel was the chief administrative officer of the city of Windsor, he's since moved on. He's vice president with the Royal Victoria Hospital in Barrie now. He has a very interesting background as the CAO of the town of Innisfil, which instituted a fairly unique partnership with Uber to actually become the town's transportation system, right? So they were subsidizing Uber rides. Certainly a very controversial measure, right? Something that I think Jason is fully aware of, but his sort of main point there with this is that these sort of platforms can be harnessed to benefit municipalities if we think of them in different ways, right? So that was, I think, an interesting and fairly unique perspective. We followed up that panel on February 16th with one on smart cities called Data Dilemmas. So as you can imagine, a lot of that discussion focused on data and what municipalities are doing to sort of think through some of the sort of data governance elements that come along with smart cities. We were fortunate there to be joined by Merlin Chatwin, Cyrus Tarani, and Natasha Tusikoff. And so what we got was a really interesting perspective from Cyrus about the pressure that municipalities are facing from the public on technology adoption, right? So a lot of the public are not necessarily thinking of, on gathering smart city technology to become smart themselves, right? Cities themselves want to be smart. The inverse, of course, is to be a dumb city, and nobody wants to be a dumb city. Everybody wants to be a smart city. But for most of the public, they conceive of this as simply service modernization, right? That they're increasingly leading digital lives, so there's heightened expectations that the government meet them at that plane as well. So there's incredible bottom-up pressure, incredible pressure coming down from different technology vendors, management consultants, stuff like that as well, right? So there is this push to adopt technology in a fairly uncritical fashion, thinking that this is what the public wants, council wants this, there is technology available, let's just go ahead, implement, purchase, let's go, right? So there is this sort of notion, this sort of push to sort of move forward rapidly. Merlin and Natasha, I thought, brought some really excellent perspective around data governance, ownership, data trust, which really kind of thinking through, what municipalities ought to do about the data being generated by smart systems. So a lot of this data is being generated about the public, about the movements. There isn't a lot of awareness about what is being captured on the part of the public. And there certainly isn't a very high awareness about what is being done with this data, where it's being stored, and who is accessing it. We had a really good conversation there as well about the changing value of data, and that for a lot of vendors, the value isn't necessarily in the physical infrastructure itself. It's really in the data that is driving a lot of this infrastructure development and the data that can be generated by infrastructure. So I thought that was a really interesting conversation, especially around kind of identifying critical skill gap on the part of municipalities across Ontario. Then finally, on March 1st, we had a very interesting conversation about cybersecurity. So we were fortunate to be joined by Kush Sharma, Laura Matukskin, and Sumit Bhatia. And so what we heard there was the sort of pressing and evolving threat that municipalities are constantly under by cyber criminals. So there's a number of high-profile incidents that have happened across the province and really across Canada, where municipalities have had their entire IT systems seized and held ransom, right? So employees show up to work one day and really nothing works. The locks on the building sometimes don't even work. They're locked out of email. They can't get on laptops, anything else. Municipal equipment sometimes just simply doesn't work. And there's a demand for ransom, right? This used to be 1 or 2 Bitcoin. Bitcoin isn't what it used to be, so maybe now it's 3 or 4 Bitcoin. But there is a demand to pay to sort of get a security key to unlock your systems. Police can't really do a whole lot aside from kind of preaching about prevention. And municipalities are often caught in a position where they have to pay the ransom, which is usually quite expensive. And of course, even when you pay the ransom, there's no guarantee that you're going to get your systems back. And sometimes they simply demand more money. And in some cases, there's no guarantee that they're going to be returned in the exact same state in which they were taken. So there's often data that's taken, or systems that are destroyed or not replaceable. Municipalities, of course, as we know, hold a lot of very sensitive data, right? Very, very sensitive data about property taxes, payment information about user fees, recreation fees, stuff like that. And of course, a lot of information about how we use community services, right? A lot of very sensitive information that we're unsure of whose hands that information now falls into. What the panelists confirmed was that there's a critical skill gap on being able to sort of hire and train people who are aware and able to keep up with the evolving threat matrix around cyber attack. So this was a kind of a smack the alarm bells kind of session where municipalities are aware of what's happening, but really sort of unaware of what to do next to sort of really safeguard safeguard their systems. So my challenge was to sort of take all these threats, and of course we did get into solutions, which I'll be talking about briefly at the end of today's presentation, but to sort of put them into context of municipal government. And there are some features of municipal government here that I think exacerbate some of these challenges, right, or at least make them harder to actually respond to. So in the paper, I lay these out as being boundaries, authority, control, and time. So on the boundaries front, I sort of dig into what we consider to be the traditional service profile of municipalities. And I think we still have this sort of notion that that municipalities are largely seen as sort of service delivery vehicles, right? That we expect them to sort of do a lot of critical services, but to sort of do them well, right? So delivering water, picking up garbage on snowy days like this in Southern Ontario, plowing snow off the roads, right? And sidewalks and everything else, right? This is a traditional service profile that municipalities often do very, very well, and they've been doing well for 100 plus years, right? That they know what to do, but their responsibility is really limited by boundaries, right? So they know what they have to do because it lays within their own jurisdiction. They don't have a lot of responsibility beyond their boundaries, right? So plowing roads in neighboring towns and stuff like that can certainly be done through agreement or contract, but there isn't any sort of formal responsibility for one to cross those boundaries and to accept responsibility beyond what's in their own communities. So municipalities tend to sort of think of responsibility as ending at those borders. Borders also fundamentally delimit power and authority, right? That and in some cases limit the sort of ambition that municipalities can actually take on, like things like self-government, right? And so when we get these new digital threats and actors emerging, it creates a bit of confusion because there isn't the same sort of physical presence within the boundaries, right? So if we're thinking about licensing restaurants and bars, there's a physical location. If we're thinking about licensing taxi cabs, there's a physical presence. There certainly is a physical presence with something like an Uber driver and like an Uber car, but the company itself only has a digital presence. There isn't really a physical presence for a lot of these platform firms in most Canadian cities, right? Which creates a bit of confusion around authority and control, right? Without a clear sort of geographic limitation, sometimes there is confusion about where authority lies and where the ability to actually exert control over some of these actors really rests. Of course, there is time, right? Municipalities, and I think like with all levels of government, are thoughtful and deliberate policymakers because they necessarily need to be, right? A lot of the services that governments deliver, especially municipal governments, are critical to health and safety, right? So we think of things like water and road safety and everything else, right? Policy changes there, could have catastrophic consequences if they are not introduced properly. So that creates a huge challenge because there's a need to sort of move quickly when it comes to digital challenges and digital threats. That sort of takes municipalities out of their normal comfort zone around policymaking. Local politics is, as you can probably understand, very localized, right? Local councillors like to be informed. They like to make sure that their individual constituents are also informed. They like to make sure that that there is consultation and buy-in, and that there is support for each individual initiative. So you see a lot of open houses and surveys and things like that, all of which takes time. So we're getting politicians out of their comfort zone as well, because the speed in which private technology actors are moving is much quicker. The threat matrix on cyber attacks is moving much quicker, right? And so thinking through some of these challenges, is sometimes very, very hard for municipalities who are used to a much slower and deliberate and thoughtful process. So just to sort of dig in a little bit to some of these on the boundaries front, a lot of these platform firms don't necessarily have a physical presence locally, which makes it hard to sort of really gain compliance, or at least think about gaining compliance. Um, when a lot of these platform firms first emerged, there was dispute about what they actually were. Were they service providers? Were they, merely a place in which transactions could actually happen, but didn't, but service wasn't actually being carried out. And so there was confusion on the part of municipal regulators thinking about what they actually were and where responsibility lay. And so there was this sort of notion that they couldn't really find a company like Uber in the same way that you could like a traditional bandit cab company or something along those lines. So there was this sort of notion that these are difficult actors to really kind of pin down. The same thing with smart city technology, right? That a lot of our sort of thinking around smart cities, at least in Canada, kind of focuses on some of the some of the sort of mega projects, like the proposed Quayside project along Toronto's waterfront. That project is, of course, no longer happening, but that's kind of how we think about smart cities, right? Big, shiny, new, technology infused infrastructure projects. Reality is, though, is that a lot of smart city technology is being deployed across Canada in a very ubiquitous way, stuff that we don't necessarily really see, and that we're not really taking a lot of time to sort of think through what's happening with the data, where it's going, stuff like that. So when municipalities do begin to sort of think through things like data governance, there is this sort of export from the community that is taking place, right? So a lot of data is leaving, it's being collected locally, but it's being stored and used and potentially even sold elsewhere. So there is this notion that there's nothing, or there's very little that a municipality can do to influence that particular export because it's happening not in the physical realm. And then finally, there is this sort of notion that cyber criminals just really can't be stopped, right? In the sense that if this was someone who was coming up to City Hall and they were breaking a window and stealing computers, there's a process where local police could investigate and pursue and capture criminals. That is confounded when you have cyber attack, right? You don't know where the threat's coming from. The ability to cross not just local jurisdictions but international ones and pursue someone is very, very limited. So there is a lot of trouble actually tracking down and prosecuting people who are responsible for cybercrime, which limits the ability of local actors to really feel like they can do a lot about it after it actually happens. All of which creates a fundamental authority challenge. That there's challenges in sort of regulating or enforcing rules around platform firms. We've seen a bit like a stiffening in some areas, weakening in others. There's of course variation in the regulations put in place across the country, but what we see is a fairly permissive structure that was put in place and only kind of tweaked later on. That's a fundamental authority challenge, right? And so we also see that with smart city technology, where there is this sort of notion that you can't really exert authority over multinational data companies. So when we think of the sort of Quayside project, there was a lot of challenge there around trying to sort of sort out and figure out the right regulatory mix. Was it the city? Was it Waterfront Toronto? Is there national standards that apply, provincial standards? And that what we saw come through, even though it was never actually made, was a fairly permissive data governance structure that put a lot of the ability to sort of regulate on the company itself, as opposed to sort of maintaining that regulatory authority with government actors of whatever order it actually might be: Waterfront Toronto, province, the federal government, municipality, whatever it might be. All of which kind of leads to a loss of control, or a loss of feeling of control, right? That the sort of notion that we may not have the authority leads to sort of a very weakened enforcement structure. So notion that we can't really enforce transportation for hire guidelines, regulations in the same way that we can over physical actors who are traditionally highly regulated, everything from the price of fares to driver licensing, vehicle licensing, stuff like that. So there's a multi-tier regulatory structure because we feel that some actors are easier to enforce regulations on than others, right? There also is this sort of inability to sort of deliver policy coherence on data governance standards, right? The idea that we're not really in a position to think through some of the very complex nature of data control, data standards, data governance, and then think through the sort of evolving value of data and how it's being marketed and sold and potentially accessed by third parties, marketers, anyone else. And then this notion that there is this sort of loss of control over IT governance, right? That there is this evolving threat matrix out there. Fundamental challenges are happening every single day to individual IT systems, and that as a result, we just don't have the skill set to really be able to sort of keep up with that, but to ensure that we're even in the fight, so to speak. Which brings us to time, right? Again, as I mentioned, there is this sort of slow and thoughtful process that municipalities like to put in place and like to think through when any sort of policy change or challenge that we're not really able to do when it comes to something like digital threats. And so local governments, as I mentioned, are under this sort of constant or near constant threat of cyber attack. It's happening almost daily. In some cases, it's being quite successful. And so trying to think through mitigation, but also protection is something that has to happen now, right? Where we're talking about procuring and advancing IT systems, over a very long period of time that is really not feasible for, to sort of match something like cyber attack. And mentioned too, the sort of increased pressure for digitization that is sort of pushing the smart city sector forward, while municipalities are still trying to work through some of the data governance arrangements and everything else. So there is this sort of multi-speed thing happening where the sector wants to move forward, the threats moving forward, everything's happening rapidly, and municipalities are trying to push back a bit to sort of slow the process down, to sort of sort through some of the sort of inherent challenges that they're feeling and facing. So I think one of the problems with series of forums like this, report like this, is that academics are very good at sort of pointing out challenges and problems. Helping with solutions is somewhat challenging, and so I'm under no illusions that we found the right solution mix. But what I was able to do is to draw out some of the sort of commonalities around possible solutions over each of these digital policy challenges. So our panelists were all very adamant that that there is a need to sort of scale solutions to match problems, and what we mean by that is that that there is kind of a commonality of challenge, right? That there's no one municipality that this is all sort of happening to, right? There is multiple cities and towns and villages that are being inundated with platform firms like Airbnb and Uber and everything else. There are there's no shortage of cyber attack, whether it's a rural or an urban place, right? Smart city technology is being pushed and implemented in communities of all sizes, right? So there is a commonality of challenge. So perhaps there is a need to sort of scale that up, and the provincial and federal government can be of support here, right? So, is there a way that that the province can sort of put in place standards for platform operation within certain areas? Perhaps, right? Perhaps that would limit the sort of venue shopping that we saw initially when Uber and Lyft and Airbnb came to Canada, right? Maybe there are data governance standards that the federal government could supply, or the provincial governments could supply, that would help municipalities build in floor standards for procurement for smart city technology, right? That there's a floor that vendors have to meet on data governance standards, just something along those lines, right? Perhaps there is a bundle of money that could be released to sort of help municipalities upgrade IT systems and procure talent. Maybe there is, IT skill or talent that at the provincial level or the federal level that municipalities could sort of tap into, right? So there is a sort of need to maybe sort of think about scaling challenges up. Second is to sort of set rules locally and recognize local power. A lot of our panelists were very adamant that that there is this sort of backstep to a more permissive regulatory structure over a lot of things digital, especially within the platform and the smart city space, where standards were sort of set at the most permissive level and then gradually strengthened, as opposed to sort of set at a strengthened level and then gradually loosened as policy need emerged. So there was this sort of notion that municipalities didn't quite recognize that that these firms needed local approval to actually operate. They were happy to sort of operate outside the boundaries of bylaws and regulations for a certain period of time, but that wasn't something that they could really do forever. So they required at some point provincial approval. Local approval. They wanted to operate legally. They wanted to operate openly, and sort of get to that stage. They required a municipality to give them a thumbs up and say yes. And so, recognizing that as a strength is something that our panelists felt that municipalities let go right away. So recognizing that there is an approval process locally that has to happen, and sort of sticking to that, our panelists felt was good advice going forward. The third is to build capacity where it's needed. And so there was this sort of common notion that there is a critical skill gap locally in terms of knowledge about a lot of things digital, right? So a great example, I think, is sort of road crews and road management, right? So every municipality has someone who's generally responsible for roads management, right? So for doing construction, for procuring pavement and getting work crews and patching potholes, and then thinking about where maintenance is going to happen on a yearly basis, minimizing disruption to travelers, stuff like that. When we get into things like smart city technology, we're now asking that person to sort of take on a lot of responsibility for things like road sensors, right? So, does this person who knows everything about procuring asphalt and and getting contracting work and everything else, does that person now have the ability to sort of think through data governance, IP, international trade agreements, data flows, data storage, stuff like that? It's really not fair for us to ask that of them, but that's kind of what we are doing when we are thinking about implementing road sensors or things like that, right? And not to say that these people aren't smart or they aren't skilled, but we're asking them to go outside of their existing skill set. So thinking about where we need to upskill and invest in talent and bring in people who can think through some of these challenges on an organizational scale as opposed to an operational scale is something that municipalities should consider. And then finally, creating or finding purpose-driven networks, something that that a lot of our panelists thought was critically important. That there is this notion about scaling up challenges to different orders of government, but there is a lot locally that that municipalities could do to work together to find solutions. So, could municipalities or like a group come together and sort of contract out IT service or knowledge, right? We see that a lot with municipalities through shared service agreements to share legal services or CAOs or treasury staff, stuff like that. That could maybe be something that that could happen locally, or even working through municipal associations like AMO or the FCM, right? So there is opportunities there. So by no means, we're not solving every single problem there, but just some things that that our panel thought that would be potentially useful for municipalities to look at. So I have talked for quite some time, so I'm going to turn it back over to Anne. But before I do, I just wanted to mention that the paper itself is on the IMFG website. I given you a bit of a clunky link here. The link that Anne put in the chat is definitely the way to go. I of course welcome questions and comments. As I mentioned, all this was done a year ago, so it's a nice opportunity, I think, to revisit some of this and to revisit some of the thinking of the panel, and to revisit some of my thinking as I brought the paper together. I just put my my email there as well. Something pops up after the session today. If you were curious about something, always feel free to reach out to me. It's just zspicer@yorkq.ca. So with that, I think I'll turn it back over to Anne, I believe. Anne or Eric? Anne? And we'll certainly welcome questions, comments, concerns, anything that might be on your mind.
Anna, don't see any questions for now, but I invite everybody to write their questions or raise their hand. But I can kick off with one question if you don't mind.
Of course, go for it.
Well, thank you so much for being here, joining us. Great presentation, Zach. And I think you have a great conceptual framework. I'd like to take you maybe into across some examples you may have looked at during your research, or some of the panelists may have identified good case study. And I was especially curious about maybe the dilemma that you talk about with the platform economy, and maybe the notion of authority. And when we think about the platform economy, we often see that governments in general, like the federal government, provincial governments, have limited capacity to regulate the new tech companies, multinational tech companies, let alone the local governments. They may not have this capacity. So have you met or seen good practice, good examples of municipalities that are able to regulate a little bit the tech companies? You mentioned a case study where the city did some partnerships with Uber to manage some of their transportation issues and needs. But do you think it's the only way? Do you think it's preferable to develop partnerships rather than try to regulate these big tech company? What's your take on this?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So with Innisfil, I think that a lot of people looked at that as a very innovative partnership earlier on. And this was a municipality that was growing very, very rapidly. So I'm not sure if anyone is familiar with Innisfil. It's sort of on the way towards Barrie. So as you're going north from Toronto, so as you can imagine, this is a fast growing place that was once very rural and very kind of centered on agriculture. So they're getting to the point where they're about 20 to 30,000 people. They require some sort of transit system, right? That there's a lot of younger people there, kids, stuff like that. And so the question was, do we invest heavily in a bus system, or can we subsidize Uber rides? And it was very it was. You can get a ride anywhere around town for like $5, I think it was, right? Which was pretty innovative, right? The challenge is that the municipality was kind of a victim of its own success, in that they were subsidizing so many rides that they started kind of describing some as frivolous, right? And so they started capping them, right? And so some people were saying, well, wait, I thought this was a transit system, right? If I get on the bus, you're not saying me, like, hey, you only get 5 rides a month, right? I get to ride as much as I want, right? So there's inherent challenges that way. So I think that the challenge that they were trying to solve was, not sort of how do we manage Uber, but how do we kind of avoid the capital investment for a bus system. I think eventually they're going to have to buy the buses and set the routes up and everything like that. In terms of sort of managing platform firms, I think it's a bit dicey. What we saw is there's a number of sort of holdouts over a number of years that that sort of waited until Uber kind of presented itself, and where it kind of presented a better deal, right? So where we see where there's provincial regulation over transportation for hire services, we like BC and Quebec, they had a little bit more authority to sort of put a stronger regulation matrix in place. So I think that may speak to sort of the sort of need to sort of have a little bit more provincial control over this particular policy space, right? Because that limits the amount of venue shopping you see, right? Where there was municipal holdouts, it was a little bit more challenging, because Uber just said, well, we've been operating here for a while. There's clearly an appetite for this. People like it, but now we're gone. And so, the public became quite outraged, right? And so council kind of had to sort of bring them back and figure out a way to regulate them. So I think that there's something interesting there to say about scale, where I think that where you find a bit of a sort of stronger regulatory mix. Hope that answers your question. I see we have a couple in the chat as well.
Thanks very much, Zach. And I see a few questions in the chat, and I see Chris Bouchard has a question. I think if we follow the order, I'll go with a chat question. Are you all right with that? Is it? Move on with next question is from Silvana Gomez, one of our PhD student in public administration, Zach. She's saying, thank you for this insightful presentation. We know that building in-house capacities in municipalities is quite challenging. At the same time, relying excessively on outsources can be complicated too. I am not aware if we have this kind of data at the local level, but federal government alone spent 15 billion in IT contracts in 21-22. She has a reference here. How do you think that, so the question is, how do you think that local governments can strike a balance between these two approaches? What's your take on this, Zach?
That's a fantastic question. Thank you for that. Yeah, I think that this is interesting. Where we see a lot of this outsourcing is certainly something that is top of mind, right? I think we see a lot of outsourcing at the provincial and federal level because we move public servants around quite a bit. We don't tend to build really deep policy subject knowledge at the provincial and federal level, right? So as someone who worked with the province, you're kind of going from, say, the healthcare policy area, and you're being moved to sort of transportation after 2 years, and you're moving over to sort of natural resources after kind of a year and a half or whatever, right? You're certainly building policy expertise, right? You're certainly learning about the policy development process. You're building that skill set out, but that sort of deep subject matter knowledge isn't really there, right? At the local level, we got to kind of do the exact opposite, right? There's very specific knowledge groups, and you kind of fall in. And you kind of fall into what municipalities lack are really kind of good policy generalists, right? So that's an area where I would love to see municipal governments begin to sort of build a skill set, right? To sort of think about how they really lack really good people who are doing policy evaluation and policy development, right? But they have really deep engineering knowledge. They have people who work in parks and they know design, they know the management of it. It's fantastic. So they almost have this sort of reverse problem. On what Sylvana's talking about though is the IT space, which is a little bit more difficult because you're buying specialized knowledge. One of the challenges that I think governments of all shapes and sizes have is that you're competing with the private sector in a space that's highly specialized. That they're paying people a lot of money in, right? Where we have to go beyond the sort of normal pay bands that we tend to use in governments, right? Everyone fits into the pay bands. Everyone's got a sort of pay band title. You're an EX3 or whatever, and so we have to kind of go above and beyond that. So when we sort of talk about building capacity, we have to figure out a way to sort of get some of that talent to sign on locally. And so one of the questions at the panel on cybersecurity was, how do you get that talent? And it sort of said, is it easier to make a public servant into a technologist, and it is to make a technologist into a public servant, right? And I think that's a really interesting question. And so one of our panelists, who is an IT person, who became a public servant, was, we can train public servants on IT. We have to be willing to invest in them and be able to sort of say, are we willing to send them back to school? Is there specialized training that we can give them in-house, or we don't necessarily need to find people who are going to be swayed away by Microsoft or BlackBerry or somewhere else, right? So I think it's about kind of thinking, getting creative about that, right? I don't know if we necessarily, want to be contracting out everything. We certainly need to in certain areas, right? But thinking creatively may be a solution here. I hope that answers your question, Savannah.
Great, I think so. I think it's a very elaborate answer. And Zachary, before I turn to our next question, maybe we can stop the share screen so we can see our guest a little bit clearer. And I would like to turn to Chris Bouchard. She's also a public administration student interested in urban issues, and I'm sure she has a great question for you.
Hi, Chris.
Hi, Zach. Thank you for the presentation. I really look forward to reading your paper in full, and I love that you were working so closely with practitioners to look at real-world problems and possible management solutions.
Oh, thank you.
I've been into the regulatory literature recently, and a lot of it is quite concerned with regulations costs and regulation benefits. In the case of digital governance, it really strikes me that there are some other issues and prospects than just the barest bones view of regulation as being either economically enabling or economically prohibiting. And I come to this thinking from the world of public engagement and how digital consultation tools especially can really have a big impact on the overall engagement efforts, instead of having to go to a old-fashioned school gym, right? Well suited to people who are retired or have flexible schedules. Online platforms and digital platforms can allow people with all kinds of schedules to participate on their own time, sometimes from their own homes on their devices. So I guess the question that I'm wondering about is, in the work that you've been doing on digital governance to date, did you find that the municipal practitioners that you spoke with were very heavily burdened by their financial constraints, or did you sense that there was an appetite to be able to use new technologies to build some of these opportunities for more social democratic type concerns?
Great question. I think for the most part, if there's any level of government that is more prone to consult, it is local government, right? That I think that it's kind of a muscle reflex for them, right? And if you look at some governments, it is sort of built into the sort of policy process, like it's just kind of baked in. Like, for instance, if you ever go to like Guelph, like consult everything all the time for everything, right? It's just this, it's like it's how they think, right? So I think municipalities are very used to that. And I think for a lot of local issues, there's a very clear articulation of interest. So on planning issues, right? If you think about, we're going to build a new apartment, right? The room is stacked with homeowners who are very angry about everything happening, right? Because there's a very clear articulation of who is being impacted. But when I talk to local government practitioners, they get very worried about sort of who we're consulting and why we're doing it, right? So with something like that, I know we're veering off from the sort of digital realm here quite a bit, but on that sort of apartment issue, who is missing from that consultation? Well, it's the future residents of that building, right? And if it's not being built, we're sort of letting them down as well, right? So on everything digital, I think the sort of question for a lot of local government practitioners is who is interested in this. There isn't a sort of clear articulation of interest in whether we're putting road sensors into the brand new highway that we're building through the western part of town. Probably people are more interested in whether we're building a brand new road rather than that there's road sensors in it, right? So, trying to explain to people, what data is being captured, why it's being captured, why you might have an interest in that is sometimes hard to do. The other thing was when we think about, the certain platform issues and smart city governance issues, and even cybersecurity issues, a lot of municipal practitioners see this as service modernization, that it's something within their own purview to just do on their own, right? So it's like, are we doing a municipal app? Well, that's a service issue. We can just proceed with that. Are we doing, road sensors or, cameras or sound sensors and, over red light cameras, whatever? That's just service modernization. We can just go ahead and do that, right? Same thing with like, are we going to get a room full of people interested in whether we are upgrading the IT architecture, right? Probably not, right? But with that said, on the smart city front, we've been trying to kind of get people to think a little bit more through this, to say, well, there is a public interest in knowing about data that is being collected, right? About images that could be taken of you and could be accessed by someone else, right? There is a public interest in that we have to sort of find where that interest articulation lies and actually make it for people, right? So we have to get them interested aside from something about building condos and apartments. So I think it's about trying to figure out why we're doing it and then trying to get people interested. So I think, but with that said, that is a challenge, right? So it's probably a very long-winded response to your question, but I hope that answers it in some degree. But if not, please let me know.
Thank you, Chris, for your participation today. The next question, I'll take the two last questions from the chat. We have a question from Zainab, who is asking, what kind of steps can young professionals in municipalities do to build capacity for an increasingly complex landscape that municipalities will be operating in over the next few years? And listening to your presentation, you addressed that question of capacity building, and so what can young professional do to prepare?
Yeah, well, I think there's there's sort of great advice with how to move up in any company and stuff like that. I think it's you need to make yourself valuable and sort of go kind of what's the old saying, you go where the puck is going, not where it is. And so I think everything digital, this is sort of where the puck is going, that even municipalities that don't understand that they have a need to sort of build capacity here, is that they have a need to build capacity here. They just haven't kind of realized it yet. So, when I posed that question before about, is it easier to turn a public servant into a technologist than to turn a technologist into a public servant? If you can be a public servant who's also a technologist, I think you are building value into yourself that that municipalities are going to recognize, and they're going to have an increasingly hard time ignoring in probably the next 5 to 10 years. Hope that helps.
Sounds good. Our last question is from Habib, who's affiliated researcher in part-time profit in public administration. His question is, have the panels discussed the possibility of city-to-city collaboration to enhance authority on regulation and even internal capacity? On a best practice side, on tackling cybercrime, perhaps a promising smart city like Dubai can be looked at. They have institutionalized their efforts by creating an electronic security center. Any take on this, Zach?
Yeah, excellent. So on the collaboration front, I think that's a very, very good point, and I've heard that from some practitioners that that was an area where they felt that they didn't explore further enough at the early stages of the sort of platform craze, right? So when Uber kind of first came to town, there was a bunch, like if you think about the greater Toronto area, there was 14 different regulatory processes happening to sort of think through Uber, right? And at the same time, Uber was kind of playing them off against each other, right? One of the last holdouts within the GTA was Mississauga, that was still finding drivers and everything else. They felt that they could have been successful if other municipalities within the GTA were doing the same, right? So they're like, we can't keep doing this if Oakville and Toronto and everyone else is not, right? So if they had a GTA summit on Uber and said that, listen, Uber doesn't just want to operate in Toronto and Mississauga, and they want to operate in the whole GTA, right? If we put a wall around and say, listen, you're going to sit down and you're going to work with us. We're not against what you're doing, but you're not going to operate until we get it right. And we balance interests amongst all of our stakeholders, because as a public entity, that's what we have to do. We're not just here to say yes or no to you. We are here to manage public safety, existing cab companies, local transportation markets, our own public transit systems. We have to find a right mix, right? So I think that is something that could be interesting. On the Dubai example, absolutely. I think what we're seeing a lot of really bad cybercrime happening right now is in small to medium-sized municipalities, like across Canada, right, where they have vulnerable IT systems, and really sometimes all it takes is an employee clicking a link in an email that they don't recognize, and that's it, right? And so, they don't have the capacity or the resources to sort of bring up cyber awareness internally, and they don't have the resources to upgrade IT talent or IT systems. If they had Dubai money, I think we could probably mitigate a lot of the challenges around this. Their challenges are sort of resource-based, capacity-based, but perhaps scale that challenge up. Maybe the province could sort of come in with something that could sort of support municipalities, small, medium, large, across the province. So maybe that's an idea as well.
Thanks, Zach. Anne, I think we covered all the questions, so back to you for the closing.
Okay, thank you, Eric. So what is striking me is really how the digital issues raise questions that we know about, territory, cooperation, expertise, municipal capacities. So it's really interesting to see how, what we know, what we are working about municipalities for years can be looked at in a different way with these new issues that just coming, they're just at the beginning. In fact, it will be more and more important. So I'd like really to thank you, Zach, to have taken the time for us today. And so I encourage everybody to have a look at your publications about digital issues, but of course, all of them. So thank you very much to have presented your paper today.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Take care, everyone.